Olá, boa tarde. Muito obrigada pela presença de todo mundo que está aqui. Espero que o festival esteja sendo uma experiência ótima para vocês. Bom, eu sou a Marcella Ramos, eu sou jornalista na revista Piauí e eu também chefio o departamento de checagem da revista. E como eu gostaria de avisar, como os meus outros colegas avisaram, que nós temos um pessoal da produção nas laterais do auditório para recolher perguntas da plateia. E no final da nossa conversa, a gente vai ler aqui as perguntas que a plateia enviar. Bom, Henry, muito obrigada pela sua disponibilidade para nos dar essa entrevista. E nesse painel, a gente quer falar do trabalho do Henry no Centro for Information Resilience. O nosso objetivo aqui é conversar sobre o trabalho desempenhado pelo Centro, onde o Henry é diretor, como vocês viram. E é importante pontuar aqui que, diferente da maioria dos nossos convidados, pelo menos de ontem, hoje nós estamos mais diversificados, mas diferente da maioria dos convidados, o Henry não é jornalista. E o Centro pela Resiliência da Informação, ele não é um veículo jornalístico. O Centro se apresenta como uma organização social independente, sem fins lucrativos, dedicada a conter desinformação, expondo crimes contra os direitos humanos e combatendo comportamentos online prejudiciais a mulheres e a minorias. O CIA, que é a sigla do Centro em inglês, recebe aportes governamentais e não mantém relações formais com veículos jornalísticos, embora esteja sempre em contato com jornalistas. E outra coisa também que eu gostaria de pontuar é que o Centro for Information Resilience faz investigação com ferramentas de inteligência open source, como a gente falou no vídeo. E só para deixar claro, assim, o Henry vai falar muito melhor sobre isso do que eu posso falar aqui, mas só para explicar para quem não conhece exatamente do que a gente está falando, quando ele falar de OSINT, ou Open Source Investigation, ele vai estar se referindo ao que a gente pode traduzir como inteligência de dados abertos. Ou seja, o Centro usa informações disponíveis abertamente na internet para fazer investigações a respeito de atentados contra os direitos humanos em situações de guerra ou não. E esse tipo de investigação, com dados abertos, com imagens de satélite que estão disponíveis na internet para qualquer pessoa que possa ter acesso, diferente de ferramentas específicas para governo, está se tornando cada vez mais popular. E a gente vai ver com o Henry aqui como isso pode ser útil, essa estratégia de investigação pode ser útil para jornalistas e também como pode guardar algumas armadilhas. Bom, sem mais delongas, eu gostaria de começar essa conversa pedindo que você, Henry, nos explicasse o que é o Centro, quando começou, quantos vocês são, onde vocês estão, o que vocês fazem, como vocês fazem, assim, esses detalhes básicos. E também eu queria que, se você pudesse emendar, como que é como que é a logística de você ser uma organização independente, mas que recebe aportes do governo e mantém relações próximas com o governo?
Yeah, and we even hire former government employees. So that's yeah. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And just before I answer your question, I should thank piauí, our host, for laying on this excellent festival. Thank our sponsors for their support, and I'd like to thank the team that have been helping me find my way around Sao Paulo for the last few days. It's a privilege to be here, of course. It's also very humbling for me to be sort of among some of the other speakers, and I've really enjoyed the content of their presentations, and of course getting to know them outside. And it's actually, I mean, I think it's resulted in some interesting potential for collaboration with some of the journalists, and you were talking about the fact that we work with journalists, and I think that goes to the heart of what CIR really try and do, which is about building networks, creating an environment where it is difficult for mistruth to find fertile ground. This idea of information resilience is something that when people hear me say, "Oh, I'm from the Centre for Information Resilience," they say, "What's that?" My my dad said that when I told him that I had a new job. That's the same father who, when I said I was going to work for the Cabinet Office, he said, what do you know about furniture? So, he's not the best audience. But what do we mean by by information resilience? And we mean the characteristic of an information environment, the way that information is consumed, created and shared, which has transformed in the last several decades. A characteristic of the way that happens, that means that people can trust the information that they find. And the founders of CIR and myself, who've known each other for a long time, and we all started our careers we were all in government at the same time at one point, all have this fundamental assumption that disinformation can thrive most effectively in an environment where there is not plurality of discourse, where there is not robust media, robust, particularly independent media, that can scrutinize institutions and scrutinize power. And so we have taken that as the core tenet of what CIR stands for. And openness about information and harnessing the fact that so much data is now available in open source because people are creating, sharing, and consuming content at such a scale that has never happened before. We wanted to provide a platform for harnessing that for good. The idea of OSINT has been around for a while. One of my jobs over the years was working as an assessment analyst for NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And open source intelligence was something new then. We were generally working with classified sources. But that was, 15 years ago, and since then there's just been this huge explosion of it. It's a bit of an interesting sector. There's lots of players with different interests or different motivations in it. From sort of lone wolf, highly motivated citizens, as I would characterize them, who are maybe in their bedroom in their parents' house, who are obsessed with like unpicking these threads of things that they find and working things up, through to sort of people that work on a more sort of associative basis, through to people that, for example, work for us on a salaried staff basis. And, they may have been on a journey through those different things. But increasingly what we're seeing is lots of people learning these skills, learning these analytical, how to deploy these analytical tools. And so what CIR offers really to government is a way to harness that in support of our government's priorities around protecting human rights and exposing war crimes in areas that are subject to conflict. So government is not very good at harnessing rapidly evolving dynamic things like the system I just described, of how the OSINT community has developed over the years and how they tend to work in this very dynamic way of collaborating organically online. Government likes to put things in boxes. It likes to write an instruction manual like doctrine, and it likes to have a committee that does that, and that committee needs to meet several times over the course of a year, and it puts lots of process around things. And my observation of the last decade would be that as government has tried to bottle what it is that makes OSINT unique, it has tended to dilute what makes it special. And yes, there are bits of government that have been sort of capturing OSINT. At its worst in government, when I would ask for an OSINT product, I would get a summary of the news for that day. It's like, well, thank you very much. I did read that myself. But yeah, so I think what the founders and now me are working to do is to make sure government can harness those that community and those networks, and so some of them work for us. But you were asking about how we work. We work with a network of associates who will work with us on some kind of
Quantos?
An associate, like, how many? Right. So our core staff now, in 3 years, we've grown to about 100. people, and we're still hiring. If you look at the website, you'll see there's some jobs advertised at the moment, and I'll be doing an interview with some people tomorrow afternoon when I get back. Then we have some associates, a network of them that work with us on a day rate. So we probably have a broader network of about 200 when we include them. And they work all over the world, and they work with us in different capacities. They have different specialisms, and as different projects or requirements come along, they'll work with us. For fixed periods of time. But then we're also part of networks that bring a lot of volunteers with them. So there are groups of people who affiliate themselves and organize themselves organically around some of these problems, and they collaborate with some of our projects when they are motivated to do so. They benefit from that because the data they're collecting as part of their group is then shared on the platform that we've created. Collaboration is key. I think there's three. I talk about the 3 C's of OSINT, and those are content. Of course, we need content for this to work. Context, how we the context of what is collected is what helps us understand it, and then of course collaboration is what helps us fill out that bigger picture of what's going on. And there's this old phrase of who dares wins. I think in the OSINT world we would say who shares wins. And so these volunteer groups are sort of motivated to contribute to the projects and to make them bigger and better. That's a broad overview of where we came from and how we work.
Só para tirar uma dúvida, a equipe de vocês, você falou que estão espalhados pelo mundo inteiro, mas vocês estão em Londres, no Reino Unido. E existe alguma outra equipe em alguma outra cidade do mundo que também esteja em maior número?
You mean that are part of CIR, teams that are part? Yeah. So our organization works fully remotely. Everyone can do their job fully remotely, and so we have our headquarters in London. That's the main office. There's a core group of people who will be in most days because that's how they work. But no, there's no greater concentration of our personnel anywhere other than London. They are, we have folks that log in from Australia, and we have folks that work from the west coast of the US, or we have some folks that work. I was talking to one of our guys who's based out of Egypt the other day. People can work fully remotely. But we're concentrated in London, and that's where we're registered as an entity.
Henry, prazer estar aqui com você, com a Marcella, com vocês mais uma vez. Acho que você trouxe muitas coisas muito interessantes ao contar um pouco do trabalho, e eu vou pegar algum desses pedacinhos para a gente ir destrinchando. Acho que o primeiro deles que me chamou muita atenção é quando você fala sobre a desinformação. Como vocês acreditam que a desinformação ela cresce exatamente no vácuo de informação? A gente tem a premissa, de que para combater desinformação a gente precisa de mais informação, mas a gente sabe da dificuldade que é hoje se estabelecer quais são as fontes confiáveis. Nessa pluralidade de vozes, principalmente a gente entende que é fundamental. Como é que vocês fazem para definir quais são as fontes confiáveis no trabalho de vocês?
For our work, we verify the content that we receive. That's a big part of the toolkit that we deploy. So for us, we will test the reliability. As we receive content, we verify it. We wouldn't necessarily trust any particular source. We will verify it. But I think there's a broader question, if I understand it, which is that if we are just going to sort of lay open the doors. And we want as much information as possible. How can people actually trust it? I think so. I've worked on this problem set of mis and disinformation for a number of years, and in Western Europe there has been sort of this consistent conversation for the last 8 years at least about state-linked disinformation, so-called interference, attempts to undermine democratic institutions or interfere with elections. And that's one part of the problem, but there are other actors that use disinformation to support their aims, from commercial reasons that people would spread disinformation, and we saw people doing that during COVID, promoting false cures, Non-state actors, we've seen, terrorist groups or others use disinformation in various ways to try and support their aims. And then we see people do it for the lols, as the hacking community call it. I mean, there's this original concept before we had this idea of disinformation of what was called attention hacking, which was people just sort of spreading things that weren't true as a hoax because it was sort of the mentality of doing it for enjoyment and as a sense of sort of power for the individuals that do it because they've deceived so many people. And some of those, if you go and look at attention hacking, obviously we're all very grown up, but if you go and read some of the examples, they are actually quite funny. But yeah, your question about if we believe disinformation thrives where there is a lack of plurality, making sure that there is plurality does not mean that all information is necessarily flowing freely. We live in open societies, and that is what has been exploited by different actors. And I think in the case of some Western European countries, it's authoritarian states that have exploited the fact that we are open societies. There's a tendency among some across, the political spectrum, particularly one end of it, that when they see this kind of thing, they're like, right, no, we need to protect our values, we need to protect our institutions, and we should stop the disinformation, we should make it illegal or something. And there was at one point a debate about, well, should we make disinformation, illegal? I think the definition or the outcome of that conversation in the UK when we had it as a group of policy professionals was that this concept of disinformation, it's something that is harmful, but it's not illegal. To the extent that there is harmful speech, there were already legislative tools in place, for example, anything that promotes harmful activities, terrorist content, all of those things, and we have relationships with the platforms through legal channels for example, taking down terrorist content. So the idea was we didn't need legal measures, but there's still a tendency to try and restrict people's expression if people are saying bad stuff. But that's a trap. That's, if our strength in all of this is the fact that we're an open society and we believe people should be able to express themselves, then there should be a plurality of voices. But there is a role to play in helping people understand how to navigate this information environment. How do we make people better consumers, better sharers, and better creators so that they can actually tell their own story more effectively? And of course, that's why we're here today, to become hopefully better creators and better sharers, and in my case, maybe a better consumer of information. So, and that goes down back to what CIR is about. We can raise awareness of things that are happening that the world don't know about. At the same time, part of what we do is raising people's understanding of how they can actually check sources, how they can actually check content themselves, and that sort of makes the information environment more robust without constricting people's access to information. And it's a much harder task than just turning off the internet every time something bad is happening, but that's the task that we choose as open democratic societies.
Obrigada.
Henry, com o avanço do desenvolvimento das inteligências artificiais, principalmente nos últimos tempos, parecem que estão cada vez melhores, assim, em tempo real, a gente está vendo isso se transformar. Parece que está ficando cada vez mais difícil você distinguir um vídeo ou uma imagem falaciosa de uma verdadeira. Eu queria saber, assim, antes de você fazer a sua apresentação sobre um exemplo do Centro, vocês percebem essas transformações no dia a dia do trabalho? Ou vocês já quase escorregaram na verificação porque existia algum conteúdo falacioso muito bem feito circulando? Você tem algum exemplo?
It hasn't happened yet. So deepfakes are getting better all the time. Artificially generated imagery and video is improving all the time. We haven't seen disinformation actors do it in any of the environments that we're active. it's cheaper and easier to use for them to just repurpose content. So you'll see stuff that's that is not where it claims to be on the day it claims to be, is from a different place. You'll see more often, much more often, repurposed content. Indeed, and I think in some of the over the last year, since you know the real breakthrough of the conversation about AI, although AI has been around for a long time, the conversation sort of transformed in the last 12 months as people sort of tuned into its power, and that's opened this great sort of debate about how we need to approach the challenges of it. We still haven't seen deep fakes affecting our work in the centre. We have seen some things in the UK. I mean, I was at the Labour Party conference last month, and just ahead of the Labour Party conference, there was a deep fake, quite a convincing one, of the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, and it was of him like swearing a lot and just sort of going on this four-lettered frenzy, as we would call it. I'm not sure how that translates actually into Portuguese, but I was talking to some of the sort of senior Labour Party people, and they said, well, they could have got away with it, but they made it. He's just such a polite man that they made this, it was unconvincing because it was so sweary. The real danger of deep fakes isn't that they won't be detected, though. It's sort of the opposite of the problem I just described. And it was summed up in an episode of a TV show called Black Mirror, where a deep fake featured. And it was a deep fake supposedly of a politician. And his adversary said, yes, it's been exposed as a fake, but that's the kind of thing he would say. I mean, yes, it's been exposed as a fake, but the harm is done. The message is delivered, and people are like, yeah, he probably would say that. So I think that's the stage we're at now. But at some point in the future, we're going to see consilience of these different forms of technology. AI-driven content experienced in the metaverse is in our not too distant future, and I imagine YouTube will be sort of a platform where we'll sort of log on to consume that, and that's going to create a whole new level of how people can be deceived by information. And some of it will be an immersive entertainment experience, but some of it will be potentially harmful, and it will be much more convincing because of the way it's consumed. So, but in answer to your question, no, it hasn't affected our projects directly yet, but I think we're tracking the range of possibilities of ways that it can actually affect people's understanding of any situation.
Eu queria aproveitar essa pergunta da Marcella e dar e seguir nela, que eu acho que ela é bem interessante. No vídeo falava muito do tempo, da paciência, que a boa investigação, né, leva tempo, e o jornalismo sabe disso, né, a gente precisa de tempo para apurar. Ao mesmo tempo, tem uma demanda pela checagem rápida da informação. Como é que vocês equilibram o tempo das investigações com o tempo dos acontecimentos, com o tempo que as informações correm? Como é que vocês acham esse ponto de equilíbrio?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky, and you have to decide what to prioritize. I think in our case, we prioritize being right because we link that to, I mean, it comes back to your point about, in this world where there is just more information being shared than ever, how do you actually find a trusted voice? And it's more important to be right than it is to be fast. One of our founders, Ross, wrote an article recently about how people were explaining content that was being shared online, particularly in light of recent events in Gaza and Israel. And there was a lot of content being shared that was the kind of content I just described. It was repurposed. It was from a different time, a different location, a different instance, but people were sort of, commenting on it. People were confidently sharing this information as if it was true. And some of those people were doing that unwittingly, and some of those people were doing it knowingly because they had incentives to do that, either because they wanted the profile or because there was a financial incentive for them to get clicks and likes and shares on the platform that they were using. So they wanted to appear as if they were as close to it as possible. For us, I mean, it really is about being certain of what we put out, and I think as consumers, that's what really matters, is what's the brand, not the brand as in the logo. I think as someone that's worked in communications, our idea of what a brand is, what do people say when you walk out the room? What are the values? What are the ideas associated with how people perceive you as an organization or as a company? And so for us, our brand is about sharing information that we have verified and we know is true. And you can't rush that. Also, OSINT analysts are quite willful people, and they don't like being hurried. So we have to deal with that as we go along. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Quanto tempo mais ou menos uma verificação pode levar?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It varies. Of the 3 C's this is the second of the 3 C's, context. So it's content, context, and collaboration, if you remember one thing today. And that's the context question, really, context and circumstances. So, I mean, you have something, you can validate where it is being filmed, and you can geolocate it, and we can come on to talking about how we do that. And you can confirm that it's at the time that it claims to be. But you won't necessarily have a huge amount of information about what's happening. It's one angle of a situation. So, but you can do those things quite quickly in some cases, the geolocation, the chronolocation. But understanding a full picture of exactly what's happening in that moment requires, in most cases, to have several sources of content from the ground, and you don't always have those. So, we have this wonderful idiom, how long does it take? The idiom in English is how long is a piece of string, unfortunately. It varies from, and it's about the context of each specific situation, how much content we have from around there, what kind of content it is. Depending on those things, then you can build a picture of what's going on. But geolocation and chronolocation can be done fairly rapidly.
Ok. Desde um pouco antes da invasão da Rússia na Ucrânia, o centro no qual o Henry trabalha já estava analisando vídeos relacionados a essa invasão. Essas verificações que eles fizeram desses primeiros vídeos acabou se tornando um projeto maior, que hoje ainda existe, que apareceu no vídeo de apresentação do Henry, que é o Eyes on Russia, que está disponível, qualquer um pode acessar. O Henry ainda não trabalhava no centro quando o projeto começou. Na época, ele era funcionário do governo do Reino Unido. E eu queria que você contasse a história sobre o primeiro contato que você teve com esse projeto da Rússia, que quando você estava no governo do Reino Unido. Eu queria que você contasse isso, que seria interessante. E também seria legal se você contasse pra gente como que a suspeita da invasão foi se espalhando pelos governos, já que o Reino Unido e os Estados Unidos foram os primeiros países a notificarem que a Rússia muito provavelmente invadiria a Ucrânia. E depois, por favor, explique pra gente o que é o Eyes on Russia, como ele funciona, como que ele tá hoje.
How long have we got? I mean, there's a lot there. I could tell you some stories. So where to start? I mean, at the time in late 2021, I was working for our National Security Council, which I don't think you have. You have something similar in Brazil, but obviously the way you configure your national security institutions is differently. But that's a subcommittee of our cabinet, the National Security Council. And so I was one of the staff working for that, and our job is to coordinate all of the national security departments from our foreign office, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our Defence Department, and our intelligence agencies, and to make sure that they're all playing the same tune, and we're trying to be the conductor to make sure all of their activities are working towards the same objectives. And in October, early November 2021, the US, led by the US, but with the UK, working closely with them because we have an extremely close intelligence sharing agreement where we pretty much share most of our highly classified intelligence with each other, had information that showed that the Kremlin was planning to invade Ukraine, and took the decision to release this information. It's worth explaining, I think, a bit about why they took that decision. And I think that the explaining that decision goes back to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. When that was done, it was done in a way that the Kremlin denied what was happening on the ground. They created ambiguity. They created a number of different explanations. Their spokespeople were not providing any kind of clarity on the situation, and that gave them this incredible operational advantage. The international community were not prepared for that eventuality, where there was such a low degree of certainty about what was happening that the traditional means of responding, of calling a meeting and convening groups through the United Nations, just weren't really equipped to respond to that. Moreover, the international community had not prepared any kind of response to it, and was not agile enough to do that because they didn't have certainty or clarity about what was happening on the ground. So in 2021, recognizing that this was a highly likely outcome, the decision was to share this highly classified information so that the international community would not be struck with the same kind of mute confusion and inability to be decisive. The idea was to make sure that particularly countries across Central and Eastern Europe, where support for Ukraine needed to be strong, and these countries themselves needed to be resilient against interference from Russia themselves, to make sure that those countries were politically supportive of Ukraine in this eventuality, but also to make sure that members of NATO were prepared to sort of provide defence support to NATO, to Ukraine, and of course that the international community, the global international community, were prepared with sanctions for the result of actions that are illegal under international law. And so that was the purpose of sharing this information. There was a faint hope, I think, that by exposing what the intent was, that we would deter it, but ultimately that was sadly not to be the case. Western intelligence, US and UK intelligence agencies actually came up against a huge amount of resistance as they tried to do this, as they tried to explain this. Other governments were receptive to it in many cases, some more than others. President Macron could not believe that this would make any sense, that it wasn't logical, and pursued his own track of diplomacy with the president of Russia. But in the US and the UK, journalists were incredibly cynical about this, and that was because of the misuse of intelligence in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, which itself spawned a number of incredibly courageous acts of investigative journalism. And it was actually some of the people that had done those investigations that I subsequently spoke to after the invasion had begun, and I was in the US, and I spoke to a guy called Warren Strobel. I don't know if anyone here has heard of him. He's a national security reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and he said, yeah, well, I exposed the misuse of intelligence, and that, my findings featured inquiries that had results that had a tangible impact in how the US oversees and manages its intelligence agencies. And in the UK, we had two big reviews of our intelligence agencies, Chilcot and Butler, and they came up with guidelines that mean that you cannot misuse intelligence in the same way that it was in the run-up to Iraq and the so-called dodgy dossier. But he and others said that, we just didn't believe you when you were telling us these things. It didn't make sense, and you were saying we have information but obviously, this comes from different sources of intelligence, but the actual granularity of what that is it a recording of a telephone call somewhere, or is it, something that, a human agent has passed on? We weren't sharing that. We were saying that we had information and so they were rightly cynical. And that was the conversation I had with my counterpart. I said, if we successfully deter the adversary from invading Ukraine, everyone will think we were lying. In 50 years' time, the archive will open and they'll be like, oh, those guys were right. It's a shame their careers ended in flames. But we were proved right in the most tragic circumstances, of course. But that perversely had the impact of rehabilitating the reputation of Western intelligence with some of our our mainstream media. But then the role of CIR in all of this, which is what you actually asked, because that was all hopefully useful context for what I'm going to say, because this is actually one of the real strengths of OSINT. I was sort of sat inside government trying to declassify, downgrade and release, as the technical term, this information that we had from extremely sensitive sources. And it's really, really painful process. But just being able to point to stuff that's already in OSINT means that's significantly easier. And so the Centre for the Information Resilience started logging and tracking content that demonstrated the Russian military buildup from late 2021 throughout early 2022. And some of that is content that I can actually start showing. I think if we pop the slides up.
Os slides.
Thank you, Ananda. So yeah, I'll skip through these. The excellent intro video sort of gave this kind of overview of what our organization does. But yeah, just looking now at sort of the Eyes on Russia project more specifically, its origins were ahead of the invasion, and what it began doing was sort of looking at these different bits of content that were being shared on social media platforms, Russian social media platforms and Western ones at that point, and verifying the fact that there was a military buildup occurring in the areas north and east of Ukraine along the Russian border. Just sort of the headline statistics on it so far. Since it began, it's collected over 34,000 pieces of information. I think 2 weeks ago we crossed the benchmark of the milestone of having 15,000 of those actually verified. And throughout this time, we've worked really closely with different media outlets. And one of the examples that I'll talk us through in a minute was a very close collaboration with CNN. But we've worked, with most of the major sort of Western media outlets and continue to do so. And then part of that's when they find content, they share it with us, or when we detect trends, we publish these lengthier reports that, for example, I think the next slide will show some of the outputs that we have. We do case studies that sort of look at trends in the information that we're seeing. We put out these rapid reports. We do sort of longer term analysis. We do the perpetrator identification. We'll come on to that in a minute, what that actually means. And then we also sort of monitor and expose disinformation. We produce sort of situation reports from the occupied territory. But coming on to what this actually looked like at the very beginning, these are sort of examples of content from before the invasion. So on the left here, you see military vehicles on a train moving. It's the kind of thing that featured in news reports at the time. But our guys are able to look at that impressively, sort of identify where that is, which direction that train's heading. We have some guys who know far too much about military equipment and the details of it and the different variants and what kind of units operate which bits of equipment, and they're able to identify that. Similarly, here you see military vehicles moving into position, and then again on the right, military, in this case, trucks with police escort moving around. And this was the kind of content that we were seeing a lot of. So as Russia then tried to say, well, no, we're not staging a military buildup, CIR could say, well, these military assets are moving here, and here. And there are certain kinds of military equipment and military capability that are indicative of the fact that they are going to take action seriously. Inside government, we had lots of different military analysts producing an overview of this situation. And they were looking for these key indicators, like the key one, and I think this was reported in media at the time, was, are the field hospitals going forward? Because that's a demonstration of intent and the likelihood that casualties will be incurred by military. So you have these field hospitals go forward fully equipped. And so, it was things like that CIR was looking for. And it meant that even though we were downgrading and releasing intelligence, there was not just CIR, but other organizations as well, pointing to the fact that there was a real military build-up happening. And so they started logging all of these different incidents. And I think that the excellent video at the beginning, which I'd love a copy of, sort of had some screen grabs from this that I think your team had recorded by actually using the platform. This is a public-facing platform. I don't think the database itself, the screen grab you're looking at now, is not. But what we'll come on to is public-facing and fully interactive. And here you can see, I think it's big enough perhaps on the screen behind me, that you can see it has a link to the content. It has sort of categorize it, drone footage, image, video. It says the platform. There's quite a lot from YouTube there, so there's a plug for our sponsor. And then a description of what it is, and then it categorizes it across here. So civilian infrastructure, hit on healthcare, civilian infrastructure, residential, and then down here you see Russian military movements. So ahead of the invasion, it was mostly this, Russian military movements. And then over here, this is the information that's been verified under the yellow on the right here, and it sort of describes where it is and confirms the date that it occurred. So yeah, that's what the database looks like, and that gets fed into this map, which is sort of beautifully and hypnotically animated, and that sort of shows you, it spells out fairly clearly the line of contact. The green instances are Russian military movements. The orange, is strikes that are captured in the content. And so just a sort of quick zoom in on what that looks like then. If you're interacting with this, and you can all go home and play with it, if you sort of zoom in like this and sort of select an area, I think we're going to, where are we going? Chernihiv, it's a beautiful town in the north of Ukraine and that I have visited before the war. And then you can select the individual incident and it brings it up. It'll have a link to the content. You can share it. It has a warning, a graphic content warning on it. Tells you the categories, the location, and the verified data in it. So that's basically what it looks like, and that allows not just our analysts to detect trends, but it allows others to interact with it and detect trends, and to verify incidents, to link it to other information. And we're improving it all of the time. Actually, the data infrastructure that it sits on, and we can talk about this in a minute, thinking about how we use smarter data platforms to link it to other forms of information, so that it would, for example, link to information about chains of command, so that it supports, for example, prosecutions through the International Criminal Court, where what is being depicted is could be categorized as a war crime. And that's the example I'm going to go on to now, is about cluster munitions use in Kharkiv, in the north of Ukraine, in the early stage of the invasion. So here's two pieces of content that we can start to look at. On the left, it's a rocket stuck in the ground in something that looks like something out of a cartoon. That sort of a rocket sort of sticks into the ground like that. And this was shared on the 27th of February, so 2022, so shortly after the start of the invasion. And this was geolocated to Kharkiv. It purported to come from Kharkiv, and that obviously narrows down what the team are looking for, but they confirmed the location that it's filmed at. And then around the same time, again, geolocated to Kharkiv, this image on the right, this video on the right of lots of small explosions happening. So our guys looked at that. They recognized that straight away. It's actually a common sight from other theaters. That's from Syria. This is called a Smersh rocket. They've seen quite a few of them. It's a Russian multiple launch rocket system that was developed in the 80s. That's what it looks like when it's firing. You can see it's quite smoky and flamey, and that's one of the missiles launching. This is a stock photo. It's not content that we've verified, I'm afraid. But looking at content from the same day in Kharkiv, so we're 27th of February here. Here's a video filmed from someone's balcony. Shows these small explosions, lots of small explosions there rattling around. And so that's indicative of cluster bombs. That makes sense if you look at the second video I showed in this case study that showed lots of small explosions. So the team knew that this was a Smerch rocket. They'd identified that it's hit a civilian residential area in Kharkiv, and that it's using what's called cluster bombs. That's what they've identified by looking at this. So just by way of explanation, this is something that was produced once the investigation had gone on a bit in collaboration with CNN to explain what a cluster munition is. Basically, it breaks open in the air, it scatters lots of small bombs around. That's indiscriminate when it's used. So when it's used on, for example, a military target, it's within the law of armed conflict, horrible as it is. But of course, if you use that on a civilian area, it's not only indiscriminate, but there's actually a very high failure rate of those small bomblets that are inside it. And of course, they linger on the ground. They have a problem of unexploded ordnance. Children find them. They prevent the ground being used for agriculture or other purposes. So it's considered a war crime to use them on non-military targets.
Henry, posso aproveitar? Você quer finalizar? Eu posso fazer um complemento aqui, uma pergunta que eu queria entender.
Yeah, please.
Você mostrou dois estudos de caso e de parcerias com jornalistas. Eu queria entender como é que vocês, depois de coletar os dados, como é que vocês pensam na melhor forma de apresentar esses dados? É através do jornalismo, de parceria com jornalistas, ou através dos reports que vocês fazem? Como é que vocês pensam essa estratégia de divulgação daquela investigação que vocês conseguiram, né, dos dados que vocês conseguiram levantar, do resultado das investigações? Porque a gente sabe também que não adianta ter a informação só para você, né? Como é que vocês divulgam?
Yeah, absolutely not. So we produce analytical reports on the data as the team are looking at the guys that are doing the hardcore kind of verification and chronolocation and geolocation of content tend to be quite in the weeds, but there's sort of layer of folks that are sort of spotting trends, discussing these things almost like a little editorial board and saying, well, we could, we could unpick that. But also it's public facing, so actually journalists are using this as well, and they sort of look at it, find things, find trends, and then ask us about it, and we can help validate those trends. So it's what we'd call, it's iterative. It's a bit chicken and egg about where the ideas come from. But in this instance, I think it was initiated by our team, and then in discussion with media outlets. CNN were keen to do more on it, and CNN put some of their own people on, collaborating with our people about it. Again, it's not a formal agreement. We don't sign an MOU with the outlet, but it's part of that sort of collaboration of the OSINT community. So yeah, thanks to CNN for the graphic there. Just sort of moving this one on a bit in terms of how the investigation then developed. That's just an example for everyone of what the cluster bombs look like when they're in a Smerch rocket. And so, yeah, looking at the location of these different strikes that were occurring in Kharkiv, this is just before February 27th, mapping where strikes had landed in the city. And this is slightly zoomed out, but after February 27th, and what you see is this sort of greater concentration of strikes down the middle there. So you go from that, where they're fairly diffused, to having this much clearer pattern, and this sort of the lanes. And if you think about like the rocket system, actually one of the characteristics of it is that it fires these into a concentrated lane over sort of slightly different range. And one of the attributes that makes this a good rocket system, if you go and read about it online, is is how concentrated they are, how they are in that lane. It's a desirable attribute of the weapon system. So following that line, the direction that line was coming back from, and looking at content from the same day, knowing the range of the weapon system, which is a matter of public record, and looking at what was happening 70 kilometers away in that direction on that day, the team found content that shows the vapor trails of these rockets taking off. And then building on that, and this on the right is another graphic produced by the CNN team, but using our data. They actually looked at another cluster of rocket impacts from the same day, traced those lines back, looked at where they crossed over, and then that was confirmed as being that location that the team could see those vapor trails coming from. So then, and this is a sort of little bit on tools and techniques. They then, our team then looked for satellite imagery, looked for by way of information. Free one would be Sentinel Hub. If you have money to do this kind of stuff, if you're CNN, then Planet Skysat or Umbra are platforms. But they pulled satellite imagery from that day, which actually happened to catch this. And there you can see from inside Russia the streak of the missile, of the rocket taking off. And it results in these characteristic burns. You saw at the beginning when I had the picture of the rocket system, all that flame and vapor coming out. It produces these very characteristic burns. They tend to move right after they've fired, so that they avoid what's called counter-battery fire, so that someone, once another military have detected the launch, they can't then destroy the weapon system that's fired it, and that's their sort of shoot and scoot tactics. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know how that's going to translate. Looking at what units are equipped with that capability, with that piece of equipment in that region, which that's sort of the Western military district of Russia, and there's only one part of the military in the Western military district that has that, the 79th Artillery Brigade, and the commander of the Western military district is this chap, Colonel General, and I'm going to, I'm sure, mispronounce his name because my Russian isn't particularly good, but Colonel General Zhuravlyov is. So that's just an example of how sort of accountability to the commander who is overseeing the troops that are launching cluster munitions that are striking a civilian area can actually sort of unfold, and how the different stages, the different tools that we use sort of are brought to bear on a problem like that. And what the team are actually working on is how they can support international criminal prosecutions for some of these instances, and are providing training to legal authorities on how they can use the same techniques to sort of increase legal accountability of that. So we can just we can leave the slides there for now. Thank you, Fernanda.
Então, só para eu acho que é interessante você falar das técnicas e dos instrumentos, mas antes eu quero fazer uma pergunta que veio da plateia, que é interessante, eu posso juntar com uma outra aqui também, que é o seguinte: o João falou, o CIR é ligado ao governo. Como isso pode limitar a independência de vocês? No conflito da Ucrânia, o Reino Unido tem um lado. Investigar crimes russos atende aos interesses do Reino Unido. No tempo da guerra do Iraque, vocês teriam liberdade para investigar violações das tropas da aliança? É da aliança, né?
Yeah, and we do in this instance too. I mean, we log everything. We log every impact in civilian areas, and we verify all of the content we're sent. We are not. It's called Eyes on Russia, but it's part of the map is called Eyes on Russia, because it is Russia that has invaded Ukraine in contravention of international law. So we are looking to hold them to account, but we are looking to hold both sides to account in their conduct of the war. So we just haven't seen the same kind of deliberate targeting of those areas. It's a really good question, though, about like limiting our independence. And we are funded by, so it's not just the UK government. We are funded by other governments, but they all tend to be Western governments. China is not funding us, for example. But we are independent in terms of what we actually look at. There is no government editorial control or limiting of that. And if we found instances of Ukrainian forces firing into something like cluster munitions into civilian areas, then then that would go in the database and that would be reported on. And I think we'd regard that as important for our credibility.
Mas ainda assim, o centro depende majoritariamente do dinheiro do governo, certo? Não do governo, mas de governos.
Yeah, we rely on grants from governments. That's who funds.
Quantos por cento, mais ou menos?
It's about 80% grants, 85%, and then we have some sort of philanthropic organizations fund our work as well.
Mas então vocês estão, assim, se vocês começam a investigar alguma coisa que um governo não concorda, vocês correm o risco de perder esse financiamento.
This is a really interesting question, because I've been on the other side of this, obviously, funding things. And I had to have a very awkward breakfast with the British ambassador to Latvia once, where so part of our work in Central and Eastern Europe since 2016 was to strengthen independent Russian language media that was operating in those countries, so that the Russian-speaking populations, for example, particularly in the Baltics, had dependable, credible media. And yes, the UK government and other Western European governments were funding this, but it was not editorially controlled. They were funding the training of journalists. They were funding sort of some of the costs to help these media outlets set up. And there's a couple of famous examples of anyone who tracks those kind of outlets, like Medusa, which is a sort of fairly well-known Russian language investigative news outfit, and that's received Western funding over the years, and it's received training funded by Western governments, but to sort of make them into how to deploy sort of investigative journalist techniques. But yeah, none of that funding comes with like editorial control, where a different part of government, our press and media people, then would go and interact with them. They would treat them as a media outlet. So that we ended up with this rather awkward situation where one of the outlets that one part of government was funding had obtained documents that were inconvenient to the British government in Latvia, and the fact that these had come to light before we had shared them with the Latvian government. We did intend to share them with the Latvian government, but they came out before we had done, so the Latvians were understandably annoyed, and of course the ambassador who manages our relationship with that country was asking me and my boss about it as we had breakfast with him during a visit to that country, and I explained that in many ways this was an example of how successful our programs were, in that we had created an organization that was accurately sort of scrutinizing our behavior. I mean, it's a small example, it's sort of, it's sort of slightly satirical in a way, but I think it is a good example of the fact that, yes, I mean, we need to be, sorry, it's a bit of static. We need to, if we are to go back to that point about trying to create an information environment that is in line with our values, then we need to be held accountable by the same values, and the same is true of government, and the same is true of our allies as well. So, not to say that Ukraine is a perfect country. I think it's fairly widely known. I worked in Ukraine. It has big challenges with, for example, corruption, and that's a big feature of the discourse in Western government about whether the US and the UK and other NATO members should continue supporting Ukraine, is the fact that, well, where's all of this money going? And without getting into that debate, I think the fact that we can actually have the debate and point to it and talk about these things is what is actually sort of makes our information environment sort of more robust, resilient.
Posso aproveitar esse gancho e complementar com uma pergunta, porque acho que um dos grandes desafios, né, que a gente vem debatendo nesses 2 dias, que a imprensa vem debatendo, é exatamente o financiamento dos veículos de comunicação, dos novos veículos, principalmente da mídia independente. Você acha que o Centro chegou num ponto em que um modelo, né, vou chamar aqui de modelo de negócios, apesar de ser uma non-profit, mas chegou num modelo sustentável e saudável de financiamento? E se sim, a que você deve esse sucesso desse modelo? Como é que você olha para frente? É um modelo perene, que tem longevidade, esse modelo de financiamento de 80% vindo de governos?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I would say no, it's not fully sustainable yet. So they started small. As a non-profit, we were trying to, or the founders at the time were trying to fill this specific gap to help government sort of harness the culture and dynamic nature of OSINT. They were small, and so they applied for grants. As a non-profit, you can proactively propose ideas to government, and that's slightly iterative. You kind of understand from them the problem they want to solve. You say, okay, I'll go away and write a proposal for how we do that. But at the time, they were a small organization, so those were very small grants. And they tended to be time limited, and so they didn't have, as they took on core staff, it's a real worry that you are taking on people for whom you have a salary obligation, but you can't see beyond the end of the fiscal year in terms of what your funding profile actually looks like. So it's improved since then. Some projects have come along that are multi-year, which is incredibly helpful. And so what you want is, bigger scale, multi-year funding, and that stops your funding profile from being lumpy. It means that you can pay people, that you can keep paying for your servers and your software subscriptions and of course keep the lights on in the office. But we're not there yet, and that's definitely a journey, and we're actually, it's a challenging thing in any organization to move from being a very small organization to actually being where the founders have direct control over everything, and they can almost keep everything in their head and kind of know everything. And you're at a stage, you reach this sort of threshold where the organization's big enough that they don't know everyone that works there anymore. They don't know the details of every single project and every single activity anymore, and you need to build new systems, and that takes investment, and you need a sort of sustainable funding profile to do that. And there's a bit of a valley of death to get through, and I think certainly in the private sector, companies don't get through that without turning this into an MBA seminar. So yeah, I think we're going through that journey at the moment. But our goal is to find larger multi-year projects to be more sustainable. And it's interesting. I mean, our highest profile project is Eyes on Russia, Ukraine Witness, but that's not our most consistently sort of well-funded one, actually. And part of that, I mean, you asked, there was that great question about independence and credibility. And the Eyes on Russia map was not funded by government until after the invasion started, actually. The whole tracking of the military buildup was, as a non-profit, we do generate a surplus. We have money that comes in, we pay off all of our costs, and then there's money left over that the centre used to develop tools, to develop our databases, and to invest in the infrastructure to do our projects, and to fund work as we go along. That is work that the centre believes is important. So the Eyes on Russia map actually started as one of those self-generated and self-funded activities from our surplus.
Mais de uma pessoa da plateia perguntou sobre as ferramentas que você usa, que o Centro usa, por onde começar. E a Ana Luísa fez uma pergunta mais geral também, que inclui isso também. De onde saem os conteúdos que são checados pelo Centro? Vocês focam um trabalho no que já tem alguma projeção e alcance nas redes? E quanto à origem desse material, eles são materiais... Vocês trabalham com materiais oficiais de governo?
Yeah. So no, it's not official government. It's not official content from government sources. So it's all found sort of organically. Some of it, the investigators that are doing the find, the search and collect function, are just following multiple channels on multiple social media. So there are certain, in the context of of Ukraine, there are Telegram channels that aggregate content from across other platforms, or that just share content that's been sort of picked up and put on channels elsewhere in Telegram. And so the team are watching those and they're seeing stuff. Some people send us things. I mean, there's a very interesting point when sort of working in OSINT about safeguarding, actually, about people sharing content. You don't want people to share content that puts them at risk. And there's a second question about safeguarding we can come on to about the people that are actually looking at the content as well. But yeah, on that first point, we actually produce guidance on some of our platforms. If you look at the Myanmar Witness project, there's guidance on the website encouraging people not to put themselves at personal risk to collect content that would inform the investigation. And so yeah, so there's an interesting point about making sure people don't sort of suffer any consequences as a result of sharing stuff directly with us or collecting stuff that they want to end up on the platform, or geolocating sort of people that have shared stuff, for example, from the occupied territories. As we geolocate it, it'd be possible for actors to identify where that's filmed, who lives there, and knock on the door, etc. So there are various sort of interesting challenges that arise from that we have managed as we go along. But no, generally this is just open, publicly available social media content that people are sharing organically, and we are trying to pick up as we go along. And then in some instances things come from journalists, media outlets, say, hey, we've been sent this, what do you guys make of it? And if you ask our team that, they'll just jump straight on it and and tell people what they think about it. So yeah, that's the sort of search and collect function, which I think is the first stage of all of this.
Você poderia falar um pouquinho sobre as ferramentas que você usam, como que é o treinamento da equipe?
Yeah, so training is a constant thing, and I'll come on. I think I'll sort of I'll talk a bit about the tools, and then I'll talk about actually the analytical mindset and our approach to that, because I think that's key in all of this. That going back to those 3 C's: the content, context, and collaboration, sort of tying all of that together is the sort of mindset of your sort of OSINT operator. But I'm glad you asked about the tools. I have some slides that we'll go through. There's quite a few of them, but I realize people don't want to be in a hot room with no natural light staring at PowerPoint slides for the next hour, so we'll go through them quite quickly. So yeah, I mean, look, the search and collect point, we look at we just use we start with fairly standard social media and search techniques. Look by area, look for keywords, look for the same way you'd look for, I don't know, if you were interested in motorcycles and you wanted to find content about motorcycles, you just start looking in the same way. But then there are sort of more sophisticated tools here. TGStat, who posted what, and search for faces are more sophisticated tools that allow you to sort of search the content more effectively. In search for faces, it just sort of pulls together content that features the same person, for example. And then there are just looking at the usual platforms, but using sort of more sophisticated search techniques than you'd use if you were just looking for motorcycles. Boolean search techniques, for example. And then what we call advanced social media content acquisition. So the idea that the kind of content that you get from the API that allows you to build network diagrams. Some platforms have limited that recently, ones that have changed their name, for example, but others it's still fairly open, and you can use that to sort of understand how information is flowing, how different conversations are unfolding, how people are linked to each other, and that enables you to flash up like a network diagram like that one on the right, and I can seldom find people that can ever effectively explain to me what they represent, but they look good in PowerPoint slides, and it's actually sort of picking into the content and the links between people that helps you understand what's happening, of course. And then sort of after that search and collect, then it's about sort of the geospatial element of it, the understanding, the verification of location. So there's a number of different tools that people use for that. I'll sort of skipping on verifying the imagery itself, actually. So you can, there's various tools online. Other tools exist, but metadata to go will just tell you what metadata is attached to any piece of content that you pick up. Photo forensics, probably slightly overcome these days, I think, by the fact that you actually want to search for stuff that has been sort of amended by AI as well, but these are just examples of tools, and I think that's something that I'm going to try and land. There is not a fixed toolkit for every situation. And of course we use Google Earth and Google Maps to actually sort of do the geolocation, look for the landmarks, translate those into, you know, what we're seeing in the imagery, you know, understanding what's actually in and around an environment. Wikimapia is just like a map wiki, allows people to sort of, you know, describe what is in specific locations and add information about it. And then as they do that, just, I mean, this idea of like how you identify features and then pick them out, you know, draw boxes on things so that you actually relate things and show what's where. Chronolocation, sort of slightly more sophisticated, I suppose. You'll see this actually this is part of a training slide deck that's been used with the Ukrainian government, and it still has Ukrainian. If anyone here reads Ukrainian, then you can practice as we're sat here. But yeah, image assessment, look at, for example, historic satellite imagery, how it's changed from one day to the next, so that you can understand when, if you know when a building was modified, then you can understand that, you know, that this image is taken after it was modified, or likewise if sort of things have moved within it. Looking at sort of some of these tools, yeah, that's an example. Slightly pixelated footage, but those are oil storage tanks, and then between one photo on the left and one on the right, some of them have been destroyed, so you know that after those. This is interesting, looking at shadows to determine time of day. So yeah, there's an interesting tool called SunCalc, allows you to work out what the time of day is. Once you know where something is, you've geolocated it, you know there's, in this case, a lamppost. You can tell the time of day based on knowing the date, what direction the sun's shining in, and so where the actual shadow of that signpost is falling. You see it in one of those pictures taken at about 1:45, and the other one's at 3:15, based on the way the sun's moved over the course of the day. So yeah, some quite sophisticated stuff. And then of course, getting onto sort of more general tools that we'd think of more as utilities for the analysts rather than ones that they deploy themselves. So how are they going to do data visualization, data organization, for example, you know, how are they actually storing stuff and logging it? And of course, one of the things that we want to be able to do is to preserve the evidentiary chain. So we need to make sure that the data is preserved in a way that maintains its integrity, that prevents tampering, because it needs to be admissible. Ultimately, what we want for some of these things is for them to support war crimes. We want it to be admissible. Here's some guidance from the International Criminal Court on how you do that, and that's sort of publicly available. And then just some other things. But here's my point. Here are some conveniently AI-generated points about cartoons. And there's this maxim that I've used in a couple of different fields, that you should always look to not operate the equipment. What you should look to do is to equip the operator. So don't train someone on how to use a tool and they're like, right, I've got my tool, I'm going to go around and use it. And this poor man on the left, he knows how to use a hammer, and he's been asked to make a beautiful sculpture. And so he's just there hammering away at a piece of wood. And actually what you want, this is more of a craft. And OSINT is no different. This is a craft. You want someone who understands how they can use different tools, who's aware of what the state of the art is, who's aware of, who's part of this conversation that looks at how tools are emerging, because the tools are changing and improving all of the time. So you want someone that is more of a craftsman. And this happy man on the right who's producing a beautiful work of art, you can see he's skilled in the use of many tools, and he can use them you know, as he needs, and just bring them to bear. So I think that's my key point. And it goes back to that point about content, context, and collaboration. The context is always going to be different, actually, based on the content that's been shared and what else you have around there, and you know what it actually depicts. You will need different tools to understand that. And the third C, collaboration, is, you know, that being part of that community of practice, sharing how to do these things is what actually makes us all better at it.
Henry, nós estamos quase terminando aqui com o tempo. Eu queria só te fazer a última pergunta, que é da plateia, que é vocês estão investigando o conflito de Israel contra o Hamas? E se sim, vocês estão vendo mais conteúdos na faixa de Gaza ou em Israel? Como que está essa distribuição ali do interesse?
Marcella, antes do Henry responder, eu queria só fazer uma rápida uma consideração que durante a minha pesquisa sobre o Henry e sobre o Centro, eu encontrei um canal no YouTube de um dos diretores do Centro que tem aulas com mais de milhões de visualizações. Então, para os jornalistas que estão interessados em aprender mais sobre open source, qual é o nome dele mesmo que eu me esqueci, Henry, de um dos diretores? Ben, right?
Ben Strick, really talented guy, really smart guy. And he is,
e todas as técnicas, ferramentas, tá tudo ali disponível. Então, acho que é uma dica legal para quem está interessado em mergulhar nesse assunto. Desculpa te interromper.
Israel, Palestine. No, we're not. In the early days of things happening, we had inquiries from media. They wanted us to validate content. They wanted us to geolocate, chronolocate stuff before they used it. So we were sort of helping them make their reporting accurate, and we do that just as part of. But we are not doing a sort of public-facing sort of government-funded project on it. We had conversations about that. There's probably, there was interest in us doing that. For us, actually, it comes back to that sort of scale question and where we are in our journey as an organization. We have, our team are extremely tired after looking at sort of after running a number of really big projects. And as the management team, we just decided we didn't have the capacity to do it. In terms of answering that question, though, what do you see more of coming from where? You tend to see more content coming from where the action is unfolding. So, October the 7th, you saw lots of content from the Israeli, from inside Israel, shared by different actors. And since then, the balance of content is obviously coming much more from inside Gaza as people suffer the consequences of what's happening there.
Muito obrigada, Henry. Muito obrigada, Alana, também,
por participar
comigo.
Obrigada a todos.
Thank you very much.